B-4 howitzer. Berlin, 1945. A Soviet crew drags a massive steel barrel into the center of a shattered street. They aren't miles away. They're just a few hundred yards from their target. This is the B-4 howitzer. German survivors called it the Sledgehammer of Stalin. One look at its design tells you why. This 203mm Titan didn't use wheels. It crawled on heavy steel tracks salvaged from T-26 tanks. It was a 17.7 tons Predator designed to reach the mud-soaked positions where other guns simply died. The B-4 didn't just fire, it executed. While traditional artillery lobbed shells over the horizon, the Soviets used this monster for direct fire. They pointed the 203mm muzzle straight at the face of reinforced concrete bunkers. The trigger pulled. A 220-pound shell screamed across the street. The shockwave alone turned nearby windows to dust. A direct hit didn't just leave a hole, it induced a total structural collapse. Multi-story buildings vanished into a gray fog of pulverized stone. In the final days of the war, if a B-4 was looking at you, your position effectively ceased to exist. M1 Blackjack. The mountains of Italy were a graveyard for standard ballistics. Deep bunkers and hidden supply lines made the German defense feel untouchable. Then came Blackjack. The M1 240mm was the heaviest field piece in the entire American arsenal. It was a logistical nightmare, weighing 64,000 pounds and requiring two separate 38-ton M3 tractors just to move. But on the battlefield, it was the definition of American industrial dominance. Precision defined this weapon. Most heavy guns of the era were blunt hammers. Blackjack was a scalpel. During the brutal stalemate at the Gustav line, American crews performed the impossible. They set up their M1s 14 miles away and hunted individual concrete piers. They didn't saturate the area. They targeted the 50-foot pillars supporting vital bridges. One shot, one hit, the German logistical spine snapped. The accuracy was so terrifying that German high command refused to believe it was ground artillery. Panicked reports described a new aerial demolition system. They thought they were being bombed from the stratosphere. They were wrong. It was just Blackjack, acting as a surgical substitute for heavy bombers in weather that grounded every plane. It proved that a monstrous siege engine could be just as precise as a sniper's rifle, dismantling the Third Reich one calculated strike at a time. Kauft wie Anzio Annie. Allied soldiers at Anzio didn't just fear the shells, they feared the silence between them. That silence belonged to a 218-ton Predator called the K5 railway gun. Known as Anzio Annie, this 283mm nightmare represented the peak of German long-range engineering. Its 70-foot barrel could strike targets 40 miles away. You never saw the muzzle flash. You only felt the 560 pounds of high explosives that followed. Annie's secret was a specialized pre-engraved shell. The projectiles had fins that locked into the barrel's rifling, ensuring a stabilized, perfect flight path over extreme distances. But its real power was invisibility. Annie lived in the Campione railway tunnels. It would slide out, scream its lethal payload into the Allied beachhead, and vanish back into the darkness of the mountain before the dust settled. The result was psychological paralysis. For 4 months, thousands of men lived in foxholes trapped by a ghost. They heard the supersonic crack of incoming fire and realized there was no way to hit back. Annie didn't just destroy equipment, it held an entire Army Corps hostage. It remains the most chilling example of a single weapon dictating the pace of an entire campaign. At Anzio, the most dangerous enemy wasn't a tank or a plane. It was a ghost on rails that spoke in thunder and disappeared like smoke. V3 cannon 150mm. While the traditional arms race focused on bigger barrels and heavier shells, the Third Reich attempted to break the laws of physics with a project codenamed High Pressure Pump. Nestled deep inside the chalk cliffs of Mimoyex, France, the V3 cannon was a grotesque engineering marvel featuring a barrel 430 feet long, longer than a standard American football field. It was not built for battlefield maneuvers. It was a fixed industrial weapon of mass attrition designed to rain fire on London from across the English Channel. The internal mechanics of the V3 were unlike anything ever attempted in the history of artillery. The long barrel was produced with dozens of secondary side chambers. As the projectile moved past these chambers, secondary charges ignited in a perfectly synchronized chain reaction, adding fresh bursts of pressure behind the shell. This compounding energy boosted the muzzle velocity to a breathtaking 4,900 feet per second, allowing a relatively small 150 mm shell to travel over 100 miles. The true horror of the V3 was its intended rate of fire. Unlike the massive Gustav, which fired once an hour, the London pump was designed to function like a factory line, capable of launching a shell every 12 seconds. That equates to a perpetual barrage of 300 shells per hour, day and night, without pause. Because these were ballistic shells rather than slow-moving rockets, no air defense system in 1944 could have intercepted them. If Allied bombers hadn't neutralized the site with 12,000-pound tallboy bombs, London would have been subjected to an unstoppable storm of steel, potentially forcing the British government to surrender through sheer structural exhaustion. Type 90 240 mm. Mainland Asia's frozen frontiers during the 1940s hid a massive secret that most Western history books completely overlook. The Type 90 railway gun stood as the heavy-duty spine of the Imperial Japanese Army's continental defense. This 240 mm Titan, weighing a massive 360,000 pounds, actually began its life as a French Schneider design before being purchased by Japan. It was a high-velocity solution for a military that realized its standard field pieces were far too light to guard the vast Manchurian border. The operational logic of the Type 90 was centered on a single vital objective: neutralizing Soviet armored trains. These 165-ton monsters were integrated into a sophisticated rail network, allowing them to act as mobile strategic batteries capable of hitting targets 31 miles away. Japanese engineers pushed the mechanical limits of the era, ensuring that this 240 mm barrel could deliver a high-explosive payload with enough kinetic energy to shatter the thickest steel plating used by the Red Army. By 1945, the story of the Type 90 took a dark ceremonial turn. When the Soviet Union launched its massive invasion of Manchuria, the Japanese crews realized their retreat was cut off. Following a strict doctrine of denial, they refused to let their greatest artillery piece become a trophy for Stalin. In a final act of calculated self-destruction, they loaded the weapon with internal explosives and detonated the entire system. This effectively turned the pride of Japanese engineering into a mangled heap of scrap metal in seconds, ensuring that the Type 90 died with the empire it was built to protect. Obusier de 520 Model, 1916 520 mm. Scale becomes a liability once a weapon grows beyond a certain point of mechanical reason. The French-designed Obusier de 520 was the personification of this extreme. This railway howitzer utilized a 520 mm caliber, a size so enormous that its shells weighed 3,654 pounds each. To put that in perspective, every time this gun fired, it launched a mass equivalent to a full-size American station wagon through the air. Germany seized this colossal weapon during the fall of France and immediately drafted it into their own heavy siege units. Redesignated as the Howitzer 871 by the Wehrmacht, the gun was sent to the gates of Leningrad. The Germans expected this 520 mm monster to provide the absolute hammer blow needed to crack Soviet city defenses. However, the sheer physics of the weapon created a nightmare for the operators. The massive 1.8-ton projectiles required such immense powder charges that each shot placed a terrifying strain on the steel barrel, creating microscopic fractures with every ignition of the propellant. This mechanical stress led to a catastrophic finale in early 1942. During a standard firing mission, the internal damage reached a tipping point, causing a shell to detonate prematurely while still inside the tube. The explosion was so violent that it shredded the entire railway carriage, instantly killing the German crew and vaporizing the breech block. It serves as a grim historical reminder that in the world of super-heavy artillery, the weapon often poses a greater threat to its owners than to the enemy it was intended to destroy. BL 18-inch Railway Howitzer 457 mm. The defense of the British Isles during the darkest days of 1940 relied on a secret weapon hidden within the English countryside. The BL 18-inch railway howitzer was a 457 mm Leviathan, representing the heaviest mobile gun ever constructed by Great Britain. With a total weight of 416,000 pounds, this monster was designed to sit on a specialized rail carriage, ready to be rushed to any point on the coast where a German invasion fleet might appear. British planners knew that Operation Sea Lion would require a massive amphibious landing. Their response was to prepare apocalyptic coastal fire. The BL 18-inch fired a staggering 2,500-pound shell, a projectile so heavy that its impact didn't just create a crater, it generated a shockwave capable of splintering the hulls of heavy cruisers from a distance of over 20 miles. This weapon turned the narrow Strait of Dover into a zone of guaranteed destruction where any Nazi transport ship would be systematically hunted by shells the size of small torpedoes. Psychology played a larger role in this gun's history than actual combat. The presence of this 457mm heavy hitter acted as a formidable mental deterrent for the German Navy. Knowledge of these guns forced German planners to reconsider the vulnerability of their landing craft, effectively stalling their invasion plans. Even though it remained largely silent throughout the war, the BL 18-inch proved that the threat of total annihilation could win a battle before it ever began. It stood as a 200-ton silent guardian, ensuring the British coast remained untouched by German boots until the threat of invasion finally faded into history. Karl-Gerät 600mm. Entering the top three, we encounter a machine that looks less like a gun and more like a self-propelled fortress. The Karl-Gerät, a 600mm mortar, remains the largest tracked artillery piece ever to see combat. It wasn't built for range but for unadulterated structural annihilation. Weighing a massive 273,000 pounds, this monster was designed to crawl directly to the gates of the most formidable forts on Earth. The mechanical physics of firing a 600mm shell are so violent that the Karl-Gerät had to perform a unique ritual before every shot. To prevent the 4,800-pound concrete-piercing rounds from shattering the vehicle's own suspension, a hydraulic system had to lower the entire chassis onto the ground, turning the hull into a static firing platform. This allowed the Earth itself to absorb the apocalyptic recoil. Without this kneeling maneuver, the gun would have shaken its own internal gears to pieces with every muzzle flash. History records the terrifying results of this engineering. During the siege of Sevastopol, the Karl-Gerät was tasked with neutralizing the Maxim Gorky coastal batteries, fortified steel turrets that were thought to be impenetrable by any standard weapon. These 600mm shells didn't just dent the armor, they crushed the reinforced concrete foundations, vibrating the massive structures until they literally fell apart. Later, during the Warsaw Uprising, the mere presence of a Karl-Gerät turned dense apartment blocks into massive sinkholes of rubble within hours. It was a weapon that didn't just destroy buildings, it erased the very ground they stood on, proving that no amount of concrete could withstand a direct hit from this steel predator. Following the war, this machine remained a symbol of the terrifying lengths to which military engineering would go to achieve total destruction, standing as a dark testament to the era of super-heavy siege engines. Dora 800mm. Just as the world began to grasp the scale of heavy siege weaponry, Nazi Germany pushed the limits into the realm of the absurd. Dora was the second of the 800mm superguns, a twin to the more famous Gustav, but its existence serves as the monument to military excess. This 1,350-ton behemoth was a weapon of such colossal proportions that it required its own dedicated logistical army. Dora wasn't something you simply drove to the front. To even begin assembly, engineers had to lay two parallel sets of railway tracks to support the weapon's massive weight. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. It took a specialized force of 2,500 soldiers and engineers working around the clock for 3 full weeks just to assemble the gun into a firing position. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a construction project that required more manpower than many frontline regiments, all to support a single barrel that stood over 40 feet high. The intended target for this steel titan was the city of Stalingrad. Hitler envisioned Dora turning the Soviet industrial hub into a wasteland of cratered earth. However, the very complexity that made Dora powerful also made it useless. By the time the massive rail infrastructure was ready, the Soviet counteroffensive had already encircled the German Sixth Army. The forgotten sister was forced into a panicked retreat, abandoned without firing a single combat shot in anger. It stands today as a haunting lesson in the folly of logistics, a weapon so massive and so difficult to deploy that the war moved faster than the gun could ever hope to travel. Even the dismantling process was a nightmare, requiring the same massive resources that could have been used to support the failing front lines. Dora ultimately met its end not by enemy fire, but by the hands of its own retreat-bound crews who detonated the weapon to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. Schwerer Gustav 800mm. We have finally reached the summit of ballistic engineering, the Schwerer Gustav. This is the largest rifled weapon ever used in the history of human conflict. A single 800 millimeters barrel, weighing 1,350 tons, capable of hurling a 7.1-ton shell, the weight of a fully grown African elephant, across a distance of 29 miles. Gustav was not just a gun, it was Hitler's personal statement of absolute dominance over the physical world. The most terrifying display of Gustav's power occurred at Severnaya Bay during the siege of Sevastopol. Deep beneath the ocean floor and layers of solid rock sat a Soviet ammunition magazine protected by a massive concrete ceiling. For any other weapon, this target was untouchable. Gustav fired. The 14,000-pound shell plummeted from the sky, drilled through 100 feet of rock and seawater, and punched through the reinforced concrete before detonating inside the magazine. The result was a seismic event that blurred the line between warfare and natural disaster. The underground explosion was so massive it generated a localized tsunami within the bay, shattering the Soviet strategic reserves in a single pulse of energy. Yet, this godlike power came with a fatal price tag. Gustav required a staggering 4,000 personnel for protection and maintenance, yet it could only manage a maximum rate of 14 rounds per day. Gustav was the final glorious gasp of the gunpowder age, a weapon so powerful it became impractical, eventually eclipsed by the arrival of long-range rockets. If these mechanical titans fascinated you, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world's most incredible, forgotten history. What do you think was the biggest failure of these giant guns? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.